The UK was the leader of the world, the most powerful most powerful entity before the Second World War. But after the Second World War, how is the US the leader of the world? And yet, how is the UK a friend of the US? Where the UK's power goes to the US? You have to understand to understand the answer to this question. You have to understand what constitutes power. Power. It's not like the UK gave gave its power to the US. That's not what happened. The UK was under siege during the Second World War. There was a time during the Second World War when the most powerful nation in Eurasia was Germany. And they had defeated everybody else. They'd taken France, they'd taken everybody, conquered everybody. Only the UK was left in Europe. So at that point in time, the UK was not the leader of the world. It was nothing. It was clinging to freedom somehow. There were nightly blitzkrieg raids on London, on the UK, by the German Luftwaffe. The UK was no leader of the free world of the world at the time. Germany was the most powerful nation. The UK was essentially reduced to almost helplessness. It was surviving because the Americans, let's go to the map. The UK was able to survive all these years because the Americans were sending in supplies through the Atlantic Ocean to the UK. The Germans knew about it, and this was causing friction between Germany and the US. So the UK was essentially reduced to nothingness during the Second World War. They still had their outposts in various parts of the world. They had Australia, New Zealand. They had their supply chains and various outposts, colonial outposts and whatnot across the world. But that is something the Americans took over. The Americans were still a free nation. They had access to the resources of an entire continent, North America. They were too far away from Germany or anybody else that anybody could touch them or harm them. And then they decided to enter the war. And they took over from the UK their entire global machinery, power production machinery, supply chains, assets, everything. They just took it over because they could. And the UK had no option. And that's how the US became the leader of the world. And they gave so much resources and whatnot to the UK that the UK went deep into debt. And they were repaying the debt to the US until the 21st century, the first decade of the 21st century. That's how long they had to repay the debt. That's how deep in debt the UK was to the US. And the US took over the entire global supply chains and machinery and assets and resources and everything that the UK had. They just took it over. And what could the UK do over it? Nothing, because the US was too powerful. That's how the world works. The US just took everything over. And the UK in 1956 tried its last gambit, the Suez Crisis, and the Americans just shut that down. And that was the official demotion of the UK to the rank of a second or third rate global power. So now the UK, obviously, they have to save face. So they said that we are allies of the US, friend of the US. They're not allies or friends of the US. They are a vassal of the US. As long as Margaret Thatcher was in power, the UK was kind of independent. To a large extent, it was independent. But everything changed with Tony Blair coming to power. You know what people uncharitably called Tony Blair? They called Tony Blair George W. Bush's lapdog. Some would say it's uncharitable. Some would say it's well deserved. But ever since that happened, the UK became, well, just like a white and rich version of Pakistan for the US, a vassal. That's it. So power comes from supply chains, power projection, hard power, military power, economic power, nuclear power, all that. And the US has that in abundance. All of that put together.